Welcome to Musical Talk. I'm Tim Sayward. This week I'm talking to American composer and lyricist Adam Guettel, who I managed to meet at his hotel during a very short London stay very recently. He's over in the UK right at the moment for the opening, which was last week, of The Light in the Piazza, which is running at the Curve Theatre, Leicester. It's directed by Paul Kerrison, and it's running until later this month. Now, the usual way to introduce Adam Guettel to a musical theatre audience, certainly, is to mention that he is the grandson of Richard Rodgers, and also the son of Mary Rodgers, who wrote Once Upon a Mattress. However, this really doesn't do him justice as a composer and lyricist in his own right, because for my money, his material exists at a level of sophistication beyond either of his two musical theatre relatives. And I think his chief debt in musical theatre terms is instead really to Stephen Sondheim, which we could probably also say of pretty much any notable contemporary theatre composer. And of course he's indebted too to classical composers, particularly of the early to mid-20th century. His two best-known works are Floyd Collins, which is the very emotional story of a man who is trapped underground in a cave, and The Light in the Piazza, which is a musical theatre adaptation of a novella by Elizabeth Spencer. It's a very romantic story, but it has very, very dark undertones, and it's set in Florence and Rome, and at points it really does verge on the operatic, but that's much more to do with the gorgeousness of the score rather than any sort of histrionic behaviour. It's a very psycho-realistic piece and a very naturalistic one. That won a Tony Award for Best Score in 2005. You may also remember, or you may also know that Adam wrote Myths and Hymns, which is a song cycle, and long-term listeners of this podcast might recall that I reviewed that way back in episode 29, back in 2007. And if you're interested in Adam Guettel and this episode piques your interest in his work, then I do recommend that you go back and have a listen to Justin Grise and me in that episode, number 29. Finally, and very recently, he was involved in scoring a new musical, which was based on the film and novel as well, The Princess Bride. Much bigger commercial project. However, the project was abandoned last year, or in 2007 rather, after a lot of excitement about it, and there was a concert in 2006 as well. Adam was going to talk about that experience a little later and explain to us really why the whole thing went wrong. After the interview, which is coming up in a moment, we'll hear from Keith Arrowsmith, who saw The Light in the Piazza in Leicester, and who has a review of that production, as well as details about the new theatre, The Curve, which is appearing. The Curve, people may know, opened quite recently with Simply Cinderella, a new musical by Grant Olding and Toby Davis, and it's keeping up its desire to present new musical theatre work with The Light in the Piazza. So, the interview. I began by asking Adam whether there were any changes to the show for its Leicester run.
There aren't any changes of any substance. There may be a couple lyrics that I've sort of fixed. When it was on tour, I fixed a couple lyrics, but everything else should be. We've added some orchestrations, some other counterpoint, gotten rid of some counterpoint touch-ups, I guess.
Yeah. So it remains. For those who aren't familiar with it, can you tell us about the story and what's the premise of the piece?
Well, in the most general sense, The Light in the Piazza is about romantic ambition. It's about reaching for the real thing, and what happens when you get it, and what happens when you miss it, what happens when you used to have it and you don't anymore, and what happens when you never thought you'd get it and suddenly you get it. And so it's a continuum, and all the principals in the show are on that continuum somewhere, and we hope that everyone in the audience will be too. The narrative is about a beautiful young woman named Clara and her mother, who go to Florence in the 50s, in some ways to get away from a pretty dormant or wintry marriage, and a wintry family life, and experience what Europe was in those days for Americans, which was a very welcoming place, and a place in which Americans were comparatively respected as compared to today, and dressed appropriately, and were full of great admiration for what they were seeing, which was so different from what it was back home. And Clara has suffered a brain injury, but we don't disclose that to the audience immediately. We allow her to behave in certain ways that are sort of charming and erratic and unexpected, And over the course of the first act, she falls in love with a young Italian boy. And so the element of a language barrier begins to invoke music. It makes music necessary. And as they become closer and closer, the mother is more and more alarmed at the idea that her daughter might set sail on that very sea that had broken her own heart. And over the course of the show, she gradually lets go of Clara and decides that Clara deserves a chance at something that she herself never really got. And it is ultimately a kind of emotional alchemy for Margaret, the mother, to allow her daughter to take a shot at it. Of course, no one has any guarantee. And that's the basic narrative arc.
Yeah, and the language barrier is quite significant, as well as you said already. I mean, it's a cliche about musical theatre, but the music takes over, or that song takes over, where the words can't express the emotion. But it's kind of it's thrown into sharp relief here, isn't it? Because of course you do have a character who's very sort of inarticulate and quite unable in English, that is, to find the words that he needs to say. So you get this kind of very gorgeous stuff.
Well, the boy that she falls in love with the strapping Italian buck is he has kind of shopkeeper's English. And that's about it. And Clara doesn't speak any Italian when she arrives. But in the great tradition of musical theatre, they both get a lot better at each other's languages as things progress. But the idea of music as a necessity is something that I feel is a factor in any show that I've written, that to some extent, music must be necessary to tell the story properly, or it's not a musical that I would tackle. Yeah. And in this case, it doesn't just stand as a kind of linguistic bridge between them, as music is an infinite language, and it does bridge them in that way. But it's also a stand-in for sex and for the kind of virtuosic singing that they both get to at certain points in the story. I think is a way of describing without depicting how sexually drawn to each other they are.
Which, of course, then has a sort of morally problematic aspect, because mentally she's kind of, younger, you've discovered later on.
Yes.
And is that kind of, that's obviously part of the sort of, it throws into sharp relief, because the music is very gorgeous, and it's very sort of, I think neo-romantic is the description
so that's very nice.
that's been given. And it's sort of so pleasurable and very, sort of you get very lost in it. And obviously that's kind of a different strategy than you have in your other shows. Not to say that the music isn't gorgeous, because it is, but it's very heightened. It's a very heightened effect here. So what were you kind of doing, what was your sort of intention musically with the piece, particularly this idea of this neo-romanticism, as it's been called?
Well, I would say that my musical default setting was this kind of thing, harmonically hearkening back to sort of Ravel, or at least attempting to, and that kind of richness harmonically and chromaticism is something I think is very useful on a syntax level. To me, music is a language, and when I begin a score, I start with just a word. And in musical terms, people would maybe call it a cell or something, or a motive. And slowly, as my understanding of the story increases, my ability to put words together musically or harmonically increases, and eventually, I hope I get a sentence or two, and I can form paragraphs. And at the same time, I'm also teaching the audience what that language is, so that we all speak it fluently by the end of the show. Yeah. And Romanticism was a language I'd always wanted to essentially indulge in. And I really did in this score, and to such an extent that I want to steer way clear of it for the next several projects, which I am doing.
Right. Okay. And it's interesting that the piece has an overture, which is kind of comparatively rare as well. Is that kind of a purposeful sort of calling back to the past?
It is. An overture is an important opening parry in that process of teaching the language of the piece to the audience. And teaching sounds pedantic for want of a less redundant term, but just introducing them to it and immersing them in it. An overture is a great way to do that, and so is an entr'acte. I love all those old forms. I think they're very useful. And if you look at the culinary arts, you still have a lot of those forms, and that art form is so healthy right now. And there are many comparisons to be made in terms of taking in a meal and enjoying a meal, and understanding the language of a musical theater piece.
Yeah. Okay, and getting to see all the bits before. What drew you to the subject matter of the show?
I wanted to write a love story. I knew that if I wanted to completely indulge my desire to write very romantic music in an unabashed way and not pull any punches there, I was going to need to find a vessel for those sounds that wasn't all tied up in a bow. And this story answered nicely in that respect. And it does end with essentially a question mark. Nothing is sure at the end. They do go off into the horizon, but we don't know what's going to happen. And nor do we know what will happen in any marriage. And I say that not ominously, as someone who only got married 4 months ago. I say it with great happiness and hope. But the story is never tied up in a bow and has an essential interrogative quality rather than declamatory.
So it's interesting that you say that you don't plan to kind of write in the future in this romantic vein, or at least to this extent. And it's interesting because part of what's surprising about The Light in the Piazza is that it verges on the operatic, and in the operatic sort of area, in the classical area, atonality's very much been sort of fashionable, for quite a few decades now. And not just that, really, but also kind of a strong lack of sentiment in the music. So is the desire to get away from that influence by that milieu?
Well, first of all, I don't mean to say that I won't be writing romances again, because I will, I hope, and or that I won't be working in a lush and tonal world again, because I most certainly will. It's about the purpose to which I put those sounds and the kinds of stories I tell. I might stay away from the kind of filigreed, almost Ravellian kind of stuff that I did in the Piazza for a while, in Light in the Piazza, because I just wouldn't want to get typecast as that kind of composer, because we all have so many other things. On the other hand, it's an oft-made mistake to sort of steer yourself away from where you really live, and what's the point of doing that? I do live in a romantic place on a musical level. I do love harmony. I think it is a language, and I want to move people with it. And I'm very happy with the table scraps of tonality. There's a lot left to do with that. Berg and some other prominent examples aside, I don't know of very many truly successful and truly atonal musical theater pieces. Wozzeck and Lulu are both quasi-atonal, not truly atonal. For the next piece that I'm working on now is a flinty, very angular, and not very indulgent kind of music that is through sung and through composed, based on some Washington Irving short stories. And the goal there is just to be funny and light and show people wanting to get things in all sorts of ways, and going to great ends to try for them, and most often failing.
Are we talking about a concept musical here, and the sense of like there not being a single linear narrative in it? Or?
It's got an interesting structure, but I would hope that it didn't. I think that the term concept musical at this point has gotten, it sort of feels like a big fat excuse for something that doesn't quite work. So I hope it'll be just a plain old musical, but in fact it is much more operatic in terms of the vocal techniques and virtuosic than even Piazza was. I've always ended up cutting that sort of music from my other shows because it didn't quite fit and didn't quite help. And now I'm making something where I can spread out a little bit and make that sort of stuff explicitly. I'm having a great time with it, actually.
Excellent. Okay. And do you have a collaborator on that, or?
Not as yet, but I usually get a pretty good purchase on my material and write a bunch of material before I begin working with others. Just because I like to know what I'm talking about before I wouldn't want to be. I guess I wouldn't feel comfortable to enter into a collaboration so early that I wouldn't feel in control of the material. Not in terms of control over my collaborator, but in control over my understanding of the material, my point of view.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of the craft issues kind of take us back to the fact that obviously you're from a renowned musical theatre family, and it would be kind of interesting just to talk a little bit about your memories of your grandfather, Richard Rogers,
Sure.
and of course your mother, Mary Rogers, also writers. What I gather that I know that there's one sort of anecdote that your grandfather heard your music at one time, and is that right?
Not just at one time, he heard it one time.
Right.
And I feel very lucky and blessed that happened. He was terribly ill. I mean, he was quite literally on his deathbed. And he was in his bedroom, and his bedroom shared a wall with the living room where his piano was. And I told him I had been writing, and he said, well, play me something, and play it loud so I can hear it. And I sort of pounded it out, and I went back into his room, and he said he liked it. And that was the extent of my compositional interaction with him. But he had come and seen me singing a number of times when I was a boy soprano, and was just terrifically supportive. And at that age, I hadn't even come close to deciding to be a composer, certainly not for the musical theater. And so I didn't have any of those pressures. And so the specter of his great success wasn't looming at all. It was just this very friendly and very funny grandfather character who I wanted to, impress.
Sure. It wasn't at all like Sondheim's experience with Hammerstein, of course, where he asked him to treat the script that he'd written as if it were a commercial imperative, and then got kind of a mouthful in exchange of why it was so terrible.
Well, I've often fantasized that I could have had those kind of times with my grandfather, but I feel that by osmosis and sometimes by study, I've learned so much from him by looking at his work.
Sure, absolutely. And your mother, I think, took a sort of a very early hand, but not a very long-lived one in your sort of musical education. And
well,
then
she was more like the Hammerstein Sondheim thing in the sense that she never pulled her punches. She was quite stern with me. You call that a melody. We were wandering off into the woods here. Where's the harmonic home? She taught me a lot of very important things. Sort of the primary colors of delivering satisfaction to the listener, and she has an infallible instinct about that, and helped me enormously. I mean, sort of set my course in terms of discipline about that sort of thing.
Fantastic. Now let's talk a little bit about Floyd Collins, because again, a very celebrated work. It was done here, in fact, I think in the late 90s, and originally appeared at the Lincoln Center, I think I'm right in saying, in 96.
No, it was at Playwrights Horizons.
Okay, which would be with Andre Bishop, and
he had just left at that point.
Okay, yeah. Right. So again, we should talk about the subject matter and really what drew you to that, because again, you have a very diverse sort of set of things that you've written about. What was it about Floyd Collins?
Well, for me, every show needs to have at least on the surface, a new musical language. So in order to have a new musical language, I generally seek out diverse subject matter so that new language will work organically, or that's my hope. Floyd was one paragraph in a book that Tina Landau and I were looking at called Life in the 20s, or Louisville, Life in the 20s. And that would be Louisville, Kentucky. And it just said, Death Watch Carnival, man trapped underground, media circus ensues. And that's all we had. And we each brought about 6 ideas to this meeting. And I said, let's do that one. She found it. And I said, let's do that one. There's something about it. And that's about all we knew, is that we both thought it was intriguing. I think as a composer who spends most of his time alone in a proverbial cave, the idea of writing about a man whose sense of himself is derived from discovering things alone, underground, appealed to me. And on a practical level, I knew that I could make up any musical language I wanted for him when he was underground. Yeah. And I also knew that above ground, I had something that I could sort of use as a departure point, that time and that place, hill music, early American string band music. And so those were the inciting events. And then as I was writing the piece, I realized I was also writing about a guy who failed in a noble pursuit. And there were mercenary aspects, of course, to what he was doing, but essentially got wrapped up in an aspiration and didn't get it. And I think as the show was getting written, I realized I was also writing about myself in embracing my desire to write for the musical theater when I had such a tremendously successful grandfather. And what if I don't have any success? Not that I ever thought or ever do think even now that I would ever come close to what he did, but what if I don't have any success? I mean, what if I fail in the pursuit of this? And it was I think I generally choose things that turn out to be opportunities for me to work out deep issues like that.
Right. Yeah, and the media circus is quite interesting as well, because obviously there would have been a lot of that as well around your family, presumably, perhaps not quite in the same way. And that's I mean, among the very many memorable scenes in it, of course. First of all, we have the idea of somebody, in a way, literally finding his voice in a cave, and finding it kind of is a much richer and multi-layered thing than, in fact, you'd normally hear from any character, because, of course, it rebounds and it echoes, and it suddenly becomes something very polyphonic. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, later we have this scene with the newspaper men just getting everything wrong, mm-hmm. and mm-hmm. not communicating very clearly and stuff like that. I mean, is there kind of is that something that kind of was from any experience or stuff like that? Right.
No, not at all. Our family has not been celebrated to that extent. I mean, my grandfather has been, but our family is not. That hasn't entered in at all. It was just the tension between a story about a single human being and his plight and how that affects his family, and the story about what's going on the surface, the sort of venality and game of telephone where facts become distorted to suit the egos of the people who are transmitting those facts, and that aspect of the story, the latter, that is, I wasn't as interested in as Tina, which was terrific because she loved that part of it and developed that part of it very carefully, and I was very concerned with knowing who Floyd was and understanding why he was down there and trying to express that through music. And so together we kind of antagonistically merged.
But of course, I mean, in musical styles, you have there's clearly as you mentioned, the sort of the folk roots of the thing, and then you have popular song kind of appearing at that point, and mm-hmm. Bartók is often mentioned as well as a kind of influence, or as a sort of a source of the music. Where does he come into all of that?
Well, that's been mentioned, but not by me. I mean, I think that if you have a couple Bartók pizzas thrown into your orchestration, suddenly you're influenced by Bartók. I mean. A Bartók Pits is essentially an accident, and then you go, hey, that sounds okay. That's what a lot of good things come out of accidents. So, I mean, I absolutely adore Bartók, and there's a You know, Bartok is a verb composer. He's not an adjective composer, if you know what I mean. His music just jets forward, and he's very flinty, and so there's those things in common too. I don't reject the comparison at all. I'm flattered by it, but it wasn't conscious.
Cool. Other projects have happened. I know we had Myths and Hymns over here a couple of years ago, which I saw, in fact, and reviewed for this very podcast. And,
where, the Edinburgh thing?
No, it was at the Finborough Theatre. Tom Cooper, I think, was the director, and so it was done.
How'd it go?
Yeah, it went very well.
Really? Good, yeah, good.
Very successful. I know. I spoke to Caroline Sheen, who was in it, I think, and although there was lots of counting for her to do, but she certainly found it an appealing experience. That went through an interesting sort of gestation, didn't it? Because you had it as Saturn Returns originally. Yes. Before it was sort of Myths and Hymns. Was it always a song cycle? Was that kind of how it was born?
It always should have been. It started as one, and then we got all uppity and thought maybe, and this is a classic mistake, well, it worked as a song cycle, maybe we should try to fashion some narrative to sew it together. And those sort of ligaments are hard to come by. I mean, when you think about material that does not relate to itself and each other in a narrative way, and then you try to you try to create a narrative for it, you're going to have something that is at best associative or have a kind of loose logic, and that's not what good narratives are, generally speaking, made of. So we went through that for a couple workshops, trying to make it a dance piece, trying to give it a story. And the more we went down that path, the more pretentious it became, and the weaker the score sounded in the context of this murky endeavor. By the time we got back out the other end, and we did it at the Public Theater as Saturn Returns, it was just a song cycle. And it has a kind of subcutaneous logic, some sort of perhaps spiritual linearity, in that it's about the flight from the self, from the core self, and the return to the core self. That's all it has going for it, and that's also its greatest asset, which is because it can be whatever a director wants it to be. In fact, when a director really takes it by the horns and does something strong with it, it often works best.
Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about two more things. First of all, I must ask about The Princess Bride. It's an oft-discussed, or it was an oft-discussed project, on subject of rumour. And indeed, quite a bit of work was done towards it, in fact, in the end. So what happened? Within the terms of any NDAs?
It's sad. This is part of working in the theatre. There's an aspect of it that's glorious and pure creativity, and there's also the sort of mundane litigation side. And it came down to a collaboration agreement, which Bill Goldman never signed, and I had known him all my life and just put my paranoia aside and just kept working. And by the time we had already done, it was 2.5 years in, and I'd written about 2/3 of the music. Had not finished any lyrics, just scraps here and there, because I always write music first. And by that time, I'm not sure if he got cold feet or whatever, but he insisted on a kind of deal which doesn't get done in this field. Essentially asked, he asked for the right to negotiate his own underlying rights agreement with any producer, and then I would have a percentage of whatever was left over after that. Unfortunately, that's not a practical way to go about it, or fortunately, it's not a practical way to go about it. The creative team, that includes the underlying rights holder, in this case Bill was the book writer and the underlying rights holder, have to work as a team and negotiate as a team with any producer they come to. If not, the underlying rights holder has everybody else in a very precarious position, and it would have set a precedent that I just couldn't be a part of, regardless of the financial downside. I just didn't want to be the first person to give in to a demand that's very bad for the form.
Yeah, that's generally. So, I mean, presumably there was some stuff that was heard publicly, I think, wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, it was all in just pure music form. It was done at the Hollywood Bowl. We made a suite. and John Mauceri conducted it wonderfully, and I have like all kinds of stuff on tape. Matter of fact, I don't have any vessel for that music at this point, but I do seek one. The Fairy Tale Adventure is something that I can't wait to do. I just want to find the right template.
Yeah, it would probably take you back to some of that sort of neo-romanticism a little bit.
There's some of that, but I limited myself in the entire score to only one ballad.
Right. Okay.
Only one ballad. The rest of it is all fighting, verb, wanting, getting, crushing.
It's a very plotty sort of story anyway.
It's plotty and it's propulsive and it's poppy and it's a very different sound. So I was so hopeful to get that out in front of people, but you don't always get what you want when you want it.
One last question about sort of musical theatre in general, really. And I'm just kind of interested to know your attitude to the form in general, because, I mean, there are moments when the Light in the Piazza verges on opera. There's a lot of classical influence in your music. And do you have any views about where musical theatre is going? Is it diverging? You know, what's happening? There seems to be kind of different traditions that are diversifying.
It's a tough one because I don't feel that I'm part of whatever vector that the musical theater is in right now. I'm not saying that I'm above it or below it, or I just feel like I'm just one of those people who's in the mix, and I don't have a sense of where it's going. I think it's in a very healthy place. Obviously, it's expensive to produce, but on the other hand, there's a really active regional. The Leicester production of Light in the Piazza is a good example. I mean, there's in the States, there's almost what you might call a kind of grassroots popularity for this sort of work, and I guess I can only speak for myself and say that even at the very beginning of a project, I'm thinking about the economics of getting it produced and writing a show that is scalable. In other words, Piazza started as a piano trio, eventually became a quintet, and then grew to 15 people in the pit plus a conductor. And I think every piece I've ever done has been waxy and waney in that way, and I think that's important because you can't always be blessed with a Lincoln Center budget, and so the direction that my musical theater is going is to make sure that the story is the thing and that the music supports the story and creates an immersive experience for an audience.
Cool, excellent. Which I think it's certainly fair to say that all of your scores so far have done. Enormously immersive. I've been immersing myself in them recently and enjoying them enormously. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's fantastic to talk to you.
And great to talk to you.
The Light in the Piazza runs through to very nearly the end of May, I believe. Adam Guettel there, who I spoke to in his hotel in London last week. The Light in the Piazza has now opened in Leicester. Did so on April the 30th. And our very own Keith Arrowsmith was there, so we'll hear from him in a moment. But just to remind you, as ever, that if you have any comments or if you want to talk about the issues raised in this programme, then please do visit our website at http://musicaltalk.co.uk, or alternatively you can email us your comments, reviews, or anything else to do with the subject of this episode or any other on feedback@musicaltalk.co.uk. So now let's hear from Keith. He, first of all, wants to tell us a little bit about the experience of visiting Leicester and indeed the new Theatre The Curve. So there's a bit of that, first of all, before he then goes on to review The Light in the Piazza.
An inlaid snaking line in the pavement with matching street furniture leads you from the city centre to the Curve's front door. And what a front door. It's a building with a mission. It makes a statement and follows a design ethic of openness. Its frontage with the streets is made of curved glass and has great steel louvres forming ribs around it, which gives anyone passing in the street the chance to look into the theatre space. Its two auditoria are back-to-back on the ground floor, surrounded at all levels with walkways and gantries, and some of the walls surrounding the performing spaces are steel shutters, which can be lifted up, which reveals the stage to the passing outside world. What this gains in openness, it loses to some degree in familiarity. The walkways around the performing spaces feel a bit like strolling around a nearly deserted glass and steel airport, rather than a theatre, and even with a near full house for the main stage, the space lacked buzz. There's few visible clues to the whereabouts of the auditorium, the toilets, the refreshments and the box office, so it might feel a bit off-putting on your first visit, but stick with it. Openness extends to the actors. They have to cross these public walkways to get to the stage, and I'm not sure I want to see actors pacing around near their dressing rooms during the interval, and already some of the walkways and gantries feel a bit unloved. There's a banner left crumpled on the floor and stacks of chairs on the night I attended. The light in the Piazza is playing on their main stage. That's around 800 seats in stalls and circle, all of which have an excellent view of the stage. Lots of legroom, comfortable seats. Although, for my money, the circle feels a bit distant from the action. It's a big, open stage, with space above and below for scenery, which must rival many of the production houses in the country. But the wing space looks a bit tight. Which leads me to this production. And just to repeat, I've only seen the preview. I didn't see the US production, but I did grab copies of the script and the cast CD as soon as they were made available. And it's a production I've really wanted to see for a long time. It's a first-class cast. Caroline Sheen from Mary Poppins, Margaret Johnson on The Town, Graham Bickley, Ragtime and Matt Rawle from Zorro, all delivering quality performances, with excellent support from the rest of the company. My only complaint about the production is that the actors seem to be dwarfed by the design of the set. On this large stage, you're presented with lumbering, moving archways and walls and a giant descending David, all in white, on a high-gloss black floor, which makes Florence and Rome feel sterile, rather than the home of culture and romance. The Neccarelli's tie shop might well have been in Lakeside or Bluewater or any other out-of-town shopping centre, so full marks to the costume designer, rooting the design and the action firmly in the summer of 1953. I have problems with the piece. And it's not just because I don't understand Italian. The script and score have a touching subtleness at their heart. But I wonder if it lacks enough contrast to be riveting. The mother character, Margaret Johnson, and her relationship with her daughter is fully realised. But the father and daughter relationship is all but absent. The odd stray kiss hints at other passions, but they're not developed, and the barrier of language means that the two mother roles on stage are not directly contrasted, which leaves me wondering if a story about a holiday romance for a young woman with learning disabilities is enough to support and engage the audience. It's therefore surprisingly old-fashioned, with old-fashioned attitudes. There's no attempt to challenge the 1950s attitude to disability at all. At points, characters address the audience directly, sometimes as asides, and sometimes whilst the action on stage freezes. But both of these techniques seem to be a bit at odds with the writer's wish to see a fluid performance. There's an author's note in the script, and it says, "From scene to scene, the action in The Light in the Piazza is continuous. One world bleeds into another. Characters walk from indoors to out and back in again. The effect intended is seamless, cumulative. As in a movie, there is rapid cross-cutting. The flow of emotions takes precedence over the literal. The world moves with the heart." And it is this flow of emotions that's the thing that you take away with you from this show. It's the mother's wish for her daughter's happiness and her own guilt at her perceived past failures that you remember most. So, it's a show that I'm really glad that I saw, and it has a style and polish that deserves its place on stage, even if this production is a little cool for my taste. 3 things to add to your to-do list. 1, make the effort to go to Leicester to experience The Curve and to support this new production. 2. Lobby for a transfer to a smaller, more intimate space like the Donmar or Chocolate Factory. And 3. Well, I hear on the grapevine more musical premieres are being planned for Leicester. So keep listening to Musical Talk for further updates.
Many thanks to Keith for that review there. I'm very sorry to say that I haven't had a chance to see The Light in the Piazza live yet. I've read the script and alongside the score, and certainly found it a very enjoyable experience, perhaps a little more so than Keith. So I'm very much hoping there will be a transfer so that I get a chance to review the show for Musical Talk in the future. That's all for this week. We're going to be back next week with Ed Theakston, who's going to be looking into the tradition of the gang show, a marvellously eccentric British thing. That's all, however, from Musical Talk for this week. Thank you very much indeed to Keith and also to Adam Guettel, who gave us that interview at very short notice. See you soon. This has been a production of Musical Talk, copyright 2009.